Whenever you're ready.
So good morning, everyone, and I just have a few questions for you guys. So my first question is, how many of you are currently in any branch in the military? Okay. So how many of you have family members who are in the military or who used to be in the military? Oh, okay. So for the next question, can I get everyone to close their eyes? Because I really want a truthful answer and I don't want everyone to look at it, so can you close your eyes? So my last question is, do you guys think that torture from the military is okay? Okay. So can you guys keep these three questions in mind when you look at this image here? So the image you see here is of a man by the name of Haj Ali. And Ali is he was a torture victim / U.S. detainee in the Abu Ghraib prison in Abu Ghraib, Iraq. And Ali ended up here after U.S. officials flew a helicopter over his home, took him away from his home and his 6-month-old pregnant wife. So I'm just going to give you guys a little bit of background information about the prison so you can understand the picture a little bit better. So the Abu Ghraib prison is in Abu Ghraib, Iraq, and it was the most notorious prison in Iraq. It was opened in the 1950s and it served as a maximum security unit with torture, weekly executions, and horrible living conditions. So from the 80s into the early 2000s, the prison was used by Saddam Hussein, who was the president of Iraq, from 1979 until 2003 to hold political prisoners. And a political prisoner is someone who is in prison based on their political beliefs or actions. So the prison was closed in 2002, but it reopened in 2004 by the U.S. military as a detention facility, and it housed about 7,000 prisoners. So now that the U.S. military has taken over the prison, the type of prisoners that were held were common criminals and individuals suspected of committing crimes against the U.S. But ironically enough, in 2003, the U.S. soldiers were investigated for the mistreatment of Iraqi prisoners after Sergeant Joseph M. Darby, a former U.S. reservist, told officials about the abuse that was going on at the prison by the U.S. soldiers. And there are also images that surfaced on the internet of prisoners who were being mistreated, images like you see here of Haj Ali. Ali's photo is known throughout the world because he is shown with a black hood over his head, standing on a box with electric cords coming out of his hands. But what's interesting is that there have been articles and reports that Ali was a part of Saddam's Ba'ath Party and that he acted as a small governor near the village it was a village in Abu Ghraib. So it makes you speculate if Ali was a perpetrator, a victim, or if he was both.
So the first claim that we have is the cultural epicene that we associate with our military, which is them being good, helpful, for the people and there to protect and serve. We say this deserves to be questioned. We make this claim by looking at this picture through a postmodernism framework. Postmodernism it comes from chapter 8, and it's a term that basically tells us to look at what we believe and question it as to why. So when we look at pictures like this and of people who have been tortured, we think of it like, we're like, oh my gosh, it's like unimaginable, it's horrible. And we kind of ask like, well, who is this? Why was this done and who did this? So normally the people who we associate with doing things like this are people who are like malicious and cruel and who don't care whether somebody is innocent or guilty of like having information, because it's normally why they're being tortured. So when we see these kinds of things, we don't normally expect like our own military to partake in like these kinds of cruel things. We expect them to be held to like a higher standard, to be fighting for us and fighting for the people. But in this case, they were pretty much torturing a man who was found innocent of not knowing the information that they wanted. So like Shamir had kind of talked about, these images surfaced when Joseph Darby released the image. The military doesn't really want us to see them in this kind of bad light. So when we get these kinds of pictures, we kind of have to take that step back and kind of question like, what else might be going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. And all of this really isn't to say that like, oh, our military is bad, but because we have these images and because we have this certain view of our military being good and for us, we kind of have to take that step back and like think about what it is we believe about our military and question why we believe in it. Now I pass it on.
Okay, so this image kind of represents the military using a more postmodern way to get what they want out of him rather than a modern way. Chapter 3 focuses in on power and how certain things have the power to influence. Modern power is not something that negates and represses human subjects as so much as it produces them. Michael Foucault wrote a book called Punishment and Discipline, where he analyzed the modern prison system. He says that the use of force serves as a sign of sovereign power. The science entails keeping people in line and getting them to internalize and modernize obedience rather than using force, threat, or punishment, like in this image. So his face is covered up. He doesn't really know where he is or what's going on. He's in this ridiculous outfit. He's limited in space. He's sitting on a box where he has these wires up around his hands, his neck, and these are electric wires. They're torturing this man for information that he doesn't have. They're abusing their power as a military to get information out of him, information that he doesn't have. And as far as a more modern way, they would sit him in an interrogation room and ask him questions to try to get the information that they need out of him, but they choose to go this route.
Okay, so for our third point, I was going to make the argument that in the same way that Hajj Ali has this veil over his eyes, so he's not totally sure who's there, who's doing it to him, or what's really going on, the American military and government did the same thing to the United States citizens in doing this behind closed doors. And if you look at it through Jacques Rancier's principle of the distribution of the sensible, basically that says that your rank of power in a society dictates what you're allowed to see and what images are okay for you to see. That's the sensible, is what is sensible for you to see. Everything else is noise. So in this, an example to make it a little clearer, for Hajj Ali, the only sensible for him was inside of this bag. He could only see, there were certain times during his torture they would take the bag off to intimidate him and show him all these military men in front of him with guns and things like that. But the sensible for him was the inside of the bag. In the same way, the sensible for the American citizens to see was nothing. Like Shamir and Zoe both said, these images were never supposed to get out. They were from Officer Darby just taking the pictures and then releasing them to military investigators. So we were dictated as citizens as not important enough to know this information, which actually sheds a pretty negative light on our military in the way that they see us. And my second point coming from that is, so for this picture, there's no way that you can tell Hajj Ali's identity through this at all. He actually was barely able to identify himself. The only reason that he knew that it was himself was because he had the same marks on his wrist that he would have had from these electric cords. So, and he guessed that was about his height and everything. He ended up being correct, but that was the only way that he could tell that it was him. So in this picture, his identity is lost. In the same way that with that bag over his head, all of his interrogators and abusers, all of their identities are lost as well. After the investigation was done, only 6 men were actually caught for it. Everyone else got off free because no one knew who they were and no one would snitch. So in the same way that his identity for him being taken away makes him weak, it makes him someone that doesn't matter to the U.S. military, makes him something insignificant. The U.S. military, them getting to lose their identity and just kind of fade in and get away free, shows their power. Which again is just another example of distribution of the sensible, meaning that because he's not important, his identity isn't sensible, and because they are so important, their identity isn't sensible either. And now I'm going to pass on to this one.
Okay, so this is
That's
important.
was it Kira, sorry?
Okay, so this is important to us because earlier we asked you the question of who all in here has either been in the military, is in the military, or has family members in the military. And this could be happening to our family members right now as we speak. And whether or not we know it or not, this could be happening whether we know it about it or not, whether we will be told about it or not. And the United States is called the land of the free, the home of the brave. But are these soldiers really being brave for doing this type of torture and not really telling the world about it, hiding their hand and stuff like that? But we don't know if anyone has died from this type of stuff or not because we're not being told about it. And we're kept blinded, as Chuck said earlier. So Zoe
use the term postmodernism to show and talk about the questioning of the military. Is the military really what it seems to be? Chuck used the concept and term the distribution of the sensible to explain how the military has put a covering over our eyes to help us kind of not see exactly what is being done today in the world. And Tiana used the concept of power and surveillance gaze to establish power, and that it has shifted from postmodern times to modern times, or from modern times to postmodern times. We hope that our analysis has been helpful today to help you understand this picture better and channel in on your beliefs of torture and war.